nation at its founding was endowed with an incredible natural wealth in its extensive forest lands. Even more incredible has been the loss of much of this resource through catastrophic fire. Many early settlers viewed the all-encompassing woodlands as an obstacle to progress and as a source of danger. Forests were deliberately fired to clear land for farming and grazing. During the 2 centuries to follow, fires of natural or human origin have devastated millions of acres yearly. North American Indians used fire extensively to clear land for farming, and as European settlers moved in, they in turn adopted Indian fire practices. Trees were felled in autumn and then simply burned where they lay the next summer, after they had dried out. In normal weather, these scattered fires remained confined and might burn and smolder for months. However, during dry years, it was often a different story. For example, in 1825, a prolonged drought in the Northeast continued through summer into fall, and fields and forests were tinder dry. Large quantities of logging slash littered the woods, and hundreds of clearing fires were burning. On October 7th, a blowup occurred in the Miramichi Valley of New Brunswick, as winds fanned dormant flames and separate fires converged to form a giant firestorm. In a pattern to be repeated time and again, other mass fires erupted at the same time. The largest of these developed in the heart of Maine, and the 2 fronts roared unchecked through forests and logging communities. Typically, there was no attempt at controlling the raging fires, and the only concerted effort was to escape with life and limb and a few possessions. When the rains finally snuffed out the fires, nearly 3 million acres lay blackened. So many fires swept our forests in the 1800s that they often had to destroy 1 million acres to qualify as a major burn. But despite the great devastation, little progress was made in controlling forest fire. The turn of the century marked the beginning of modern forest fire technology. Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House, and the close relationship between the president and Chief Forester Gifford Pinchot fostered dramatic progress in forest conservation. In 1905, the fledgling U.S. Forest Service was given custody of America's vast public forest reserves and accepted the responsibility of actively fighting wildfires. District 1 of the Forest Service stretched across the northern states, from the Great Lakes to the Oregon border, with headquarters in Missoula, Montana. District Forester William B. Greeley and his meager staff faced the formidable task of managing and protecting these woodlands. Rainfall in 1910 had dropped to a 40-year low, and as early as March, temperatures began to soar. In Montana and Idaho, thermometer readings were the highest on record, and no relief was in sight. The first fires of the 1910 season broke out in northwestern Montana on April 29th. And severe lightning storms ignited several more in rapid succession. By late June, fires were burning in nearly all the forests of the district. The Forest Service recruited manpower in Spokane, Missoula, and Butte, and sent firefighters to the various fronts. Transportation was primitive and telephone communications almost non-existent. The inexperienced men worked in the oppressive heat, with only hand tools to claw out fire breaks ahead of the advancing flames. Despite the odds, Greeley was optimistic that the fires would be controlled. But on August 20th, disaster struck. A wind of hurricane force roared in from the southwest, whipping the existing fires and producing what came to be called the Big Blowup. A wild, surging firestorm started near Elk City, Idaho, and raged east across the mountains, consuming everything in its path. Once again, a major wildfire was out of control. One-third of the city of Wallace went up in flames, and 4 small towns were totally wiped out. Finally, on August 22nd, the winds calmed and a light rain began to fall. The big burn was triggered by a quirk of nature, could only be put out by another twist in the weather. The toll of the fire was great. In terms of timberland, over 3 million acres were destroyed. The cost of firefighting was $800,000, a staggering sum at the time, and 85 lives were lost, mostly among fire crews. But much was gained as well. The young Forest Service acquired a wealth of experience in its first attempt to stem a major fire. It was obvious that forest fires became increasingly more difficult to control as they grew in size. The early reporting of small fires was essential to a successful fire suppression program. Rangers, or fire wardens, were employed to watch for fires on both public and private lands. Ranging the woods on horseback, the job was not only to spot the blaze, but to reach it and put it out. During the first decade, the greatest progress in detection was by private protection associations. In 1911, Congress passed the Weeks Law, which included a new policy of federal cooperation with state forestry agencies, and it greatly encouraged expansion in this field. The early patrolmen developed observation points along their routes, generally on prominent peaks or tall trees with a good view of the surrounding terrain. These were gradually followed by permanent lookout stations, which steadily increased in number throughout the country, and their design and height varied according to the terrain and the imagination of the builders. Wisconsin's flat terrain called for a wooden skyscraper. This rustic shack in Arkansas housed both the lookout and his family. A high peak in the Willamette National Forest provided a view over miles of Oregon's mountains, and a tall steel tower guarded Georgia's Suwannee Forest. The first fire lookouts were equipped with little more than a map and a compass, and fire spotting techniques were rudimentary. They roughly calculated the direction of a visible smoke and estimated the distance by eye. In 1910, W.B. Osborne invented the firefinder, a sighting device which pivoted on a circular scale and accurately plotted the azimuth of a blaze. The lookout telephoned the reading to a ranger station where they were plotted on a map. A sighting from another lookout was similarly plotted, and the intersecting lines pinpointed the location. Many improvements have been made to Osborne's original concept, but the principle remains the same. The difficulty of communication has always been a major problem in forest fire suppression. A fire lookout might spot a blaze in a remote area, but it could take hours or days for him to bring out the report. Carrier pigeons were used with some success in the 1920s to carry messages. In one instance, a ranger took 2 birds to the scene of a fire and released one to call for more help. Then, when he was able to bring the blaze under control after all, he released the other to cancel a call. Another method was signaling with a hand mirror reflecting the rays of the sun. With a heliograph, the beam of light was interrupted with a shutter to spell out a message. It was, of course, of no use unless one had a clear line of sight, the sun was shining, and both sender and receiver understood Morse code. The real winner, however, was the telephone, which had been invented in 1876, and by the end of the century was in general use around the country. Despite the problems of stringing wires through the woods, it was the only reliable means of rapid communication in the forest during the early 1900s. The Vermont State Forestry Department experimented with radio transmission as early as 1909, and testing continued in various locations during the next decade. By 1930, there was a push to provide wireless communication between lookouts, ranger stations, and the fire line. 1919 brought another innovation to fire detection. World War I had ended, and with it the daring-do era of the fledgling Army Air Corps. A young major, Henry A. Hap Arnold, was looking for something useful for his restless group of flyers to do. By chance, he met California District Forester Kurt Du Bois, who was looking for a way to improve forest fire detection. As they discussed their separate problems, a new idea was hatched. Why not use the military planes and pilots to patrol the forest?
Contact.
Their idea developed into an organized fire patrol along California's Sierra Nevada. Starting in June, 6 Army pilots flying Curtiss Jennies covered 4 to 6 million acres of forest twice a day. By fall, the area searched had been expanded to 20 million acres and 422 fires were reported. Initially, the aircraft were not equipped with radios, and reporting fires was a cumbersome affair. The patrol sent back reports by carrier pigeons or dropped a weighted message with a ribbon attached for visibility. The next year, radios were added to the planes, which greatly improved communications. Developments in logging methods also had an effect on firefighting technology. Loggers began using crawler tractors to skid logs in the 20s, and there were also experiments using a blade to push dirt. In 1925, Forester Ted Flynn used the technique to build a forest road, and in 1932, the bulldozer, as it was called, made several miles of fire breaks at a Southern California fire. The crawler tractor also gave impetus to the fire plow. Horse-drawn plows had long been used to dig fire trenches, and the improved power source led to new innovations. The fire plow became the backbone of fire suppression equipment in the South and Lake states, while the bulldozer gained dominance in the rugged western terrain. The 1910 fire had clearly demonstrated the need for organized firefighting crews, trained, equipped, and ready to attack a new blaze quickly. The Depression of the 1930s had left a vast pool of unemployed, and as part of his sweeping New Deal, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps. An amateur forester himself, Roosevelt assigned a majority of the young men of the CCC to the Forest Service. Under Army management, the Corps divided its efforts about equally between forest improvement and protection, and its impact on fire control was staggering. In a single year, the enrollees cleared nearly 12,000 miles of motor trails, stretched 44,000 miles of telephone wire, and built 611 lookout towers. These construction teams could also serve as firefighters at a moment's notice. The CCC thus became a model for the trained fire crew both during its years of service and after its termination in 1942. Just as wars test an army's preparedness, so major fires test the capabilities of fire protection agencies. Several major fires followed the Big Blowup of 1910. But the one which had the most impact at the time on the evolution of fire technology occurred in western Oregon. The Tillamook Burn of August 1933 began under classical fire conditions, but according to popular tradition was ignited in a unique way. Loggers had been asked to shut down their operations, but one small operator hurried to drag in a few more logs with a steam donkey before complying. Somehow, the last log created enough friction as it skidded through the logging debris to cause ignition. The logging crew struggled to put out the fire, but it was soon out of control. A lookout 10 miles to the south spotted the smoke and sounded the alarm. This time, organized fire crews were ready nearby and arrived quickly by motor truck. 1,000 enrollees from nearby CCC camps joined other fighters for their first major fire campaign. However, motor roads into the woods were scarce, and access to the fire often entailed a long trek on foot or by mule train. Telephone lines were strung out for communication, but the vulnerable wires were burned out time and again, and the Forest Service's new portable radio was brought in to fill the gap. The 3,000 workers had confined the blaze to 40,000 acres when once again nature played its cruel trick. The dreaded east wind rose and humidity dropped to 16%. Suddenly, the fire blew up, literally, exploding with nuclear ferocity. Firefighters lost control as the awesome wall of fire advanced westward along a 15-mile front. In the next 20 hours, the firestorm raged across an additional 240,000 acres of prime virgin timber, as shown in this rare footage of the burn. After 2 weeks of terror, the welcome rains finally arrived and the fire gradually died down. As in previous fires, the basic suppression technique had been to deny the fire its fuel by scraping away wood and brush in a swath around the blaze. Firefighters cleared lines by hand, using shovels, axes, and other tools common to farms and logging camps. But some new tools specifically developed for the fire line were appearing. Possibly the most celebrated was a Pulaski, a combination axe and hoe, which was invented by Ed Pulaski, the hero of the great 1910 fire. As a direct result of the Tillamook Burn, agencies adopted stringent fire prevention measures, such as regulations prohibiting logging when fire danger reached the critical point. Loggers responded by initiating the hoot owl shift, starting at first light in order to get in a day's work before having to shut down during the heat of the afternoon. The Tillamook Burn also contributed to the adoption by the U.S. Forest Service of the 10 a.m. policy. Every effort was made to extinguish all fires before 10 a.m. the day following detection, before temperatures rose and humidity dropped. If this first effort failed, firefighters were to press for suppression by 10 a.m. of each succeeding day. From an almost complete lack of forest fire protection prior to 1910, the service had within 25 years swung over to a determination to suppress all wildfires swiftly. Lookout towers and aerial patrols led to the detection of fires while they were still small, but in some cases it might take days to reach a remote blaze. By 1936, fire agencies used planes to parachute supplies to lookout towers and firefighters. The success of this technique led to the idea of dropping the firefighters themselves. In 1939, the U.S. Forest Service conducted jumping experiments near Winthrop, Washington. Men wearing special protective clothing safely made 58 jumps into a variety of terrain from open meadows to dense forest. Parachuted equipment and supplies followed to form a well-equipped fire control unit in record time. On July 12th of the next year, the first operational jump took place. 2 men dropped into Idaho's Nez Perce National Forest to successfully suppress a small blaze. The Forest Service established a parachute training center in Missoula, Montana, which included rigorous physical conditioning as well as instruction in jumping techniques. In the past, firefighters had borrowed heavily from military experience, but in this case, the tables were turned. The smoke jumpers, as they were called, were so successful that the Army paratrooper program was patterned on the same ideas and techniques. The 555th Paratrooper Battalion was actually trained at the Missoula base at the beginning of World War II. Water has always played a part in wildfire suppression. The backpack pump was in use by 1914 and could be filled from streams or tanks packed in by mule. Despite its minuscule water supply, it was and remains a valuable fire tool, particularly to douse smoldering embers in mop-up operations. As the gasoline engine was improved, portable pumps were developed which could draw water from nearby streams and lakes. By the late 20s, fire trucks were being developed for use in the woods. The first tanker units were assembled using available commercial components. An industrial pump and metal tanks were mounted on a suitable truck chassis. Over the years, pumps and tanks have been mounted together or separately onto trucks of all sizes, both permanently and as slide-in units. In one form or another, the ground tanker has become the central means of fire suppression in many areas. The idea of dropping water on forest fires from aircraft was suggested as early as the 1920s. Sporadic experiments took place throughout the 30s using a variety of containers, such as these 10-gallon bombs, made by soldering together two kerosene tins. The containers were designed to burst on impact and splatter the surrounding area. The results were not too encouraging, and the falling objects endangered ground crews. The aerial bombing experiences of World War II triggered renewed interest in the concept of aerial tankers. In the early 50s, with the devastating results of wartime firebombing still fresh in mind, Deputy State Forester James Mace of the California Division of Forestry spearheaded a drive to institute an intensive study of fire behavior and new fire suppression methods. He obtained the cooperation of Dr. Keith Arnold, fire research specialist at the University of California, Berkeley, and Operation Firestop was born. In 1954, the U.S. Forest Service, along with some 30 other fire agencies, pooled their facilities, experience, and manpower to convene a one-year research project. Headquartered at Camp Pendleton, the extensive Marine Corps base in Southern California, the project had the support of the Armed Forces, the U.S. Weather Bureau, as well as private industry. One of the programs of Operation Firestop was the extensive testing of aerial bombing methods. A Navy Avenger torpedo plane was modified by installing a 600-gallon plywood tank in its bomb bay, waterproofed with a rubber weather balloon. In test, doors of the tank were electrically released and the balloon burst, drenching areas up to 90 by 275 feet. This successful experiment led to further modifications, and the TBM led the way to the modern aerial tanker. However, the first extensive field use of the retardant bombers had a more humble origin. In 1955, Joseph Ely, fire control officer at Northern California's Mendocino National Forest, had an idea. He talked to crop duster pilot Floyd Nolta about developing a way to use a Stearman biplane as an aerial tanker. A week later, the innovative Nolta had cut a hole in the bottom of his plane and fitted a release gate operated by a pull rope. Tests made dropping the 100-gallon charge looked very promising. On August 13th, Floyd's brother Vance had an opportunity to try out their contraption on a real blaze. A hunter's fire had escaped in the Mendocino forest and was burning about 500 acres of timber and brush. Vance shuttled his little biplane back and forth between Willows Airport and the fire's edge to drop his load on the hottest spots. The results were hardly spectacular, but they did assist the ground crews in holding the fire line and qualified the air tanker as a valuable addition to the firefighting team. After these first operational drops, Ely organized a 7-tanker squadron of Stearman and N3N agricultural airplanes for the 1956 fire season. Now, chemicals were added to the water to reduce evaporation and improve its fire-stopping ability. These borate bombers, as they were called, participated in the control of 23 fires by summer's end, dropping a total of 123,000 gallons of retardant. Encouraged by these field trials, the Forest Service again turned to the larger Navy torpedo planes. 8 of these aircraft were fitted with 400-gallon tanks to form a firefighting air force. As time went by, a variety of war surplus planes joined the ranks, such as the lumbering PBY flying boat, the Air Force's sleek B-26, and the Navy's Mammoth Mars with a 7,000-gallon payload. The Forest Service had experimented with the autogyro in the 30s, but it wasn't until the emergence of the helicopter in the mid-40s that the rotary-winged aircraft became really practical for forestry service. Any level clearing could be used as a landing field, and an obvious use was the transportation of personnel and supplies and as an observation platform in the sky. Laying fire hose in rugged terrain can be difficult and time-consuming. Laying hose with a helicopter was tested during Operation Firestop. In an experiment at Camp Pendleton, the pilot reached down from his hovering craft and picked up the end of a hose from a fire truck. Flying away across a field, he unreeled the hose as he went. In later tests, accordion-folded cotton hose was pulled directly from a tray suspended beneath the helicopter. Up to 1,000 feet of lightweight hose could be handled in this manner. Another fire stop activity was the testing of fire-retardant chemicals for ground and aerial use. After preliminary lab tests in Berkeley, the chemicals that showed promise were tested under field conditions at Camp Pendleton. plots of grass and brush were partially sprayed with retardants and then fired to determine the fire-stopping properties of each substance. Operation Fire Stop was a milestone in wildfire research, and since that time there's been a virtual explosion of fire technology. In addition to research coming from established federal fire labs and equipment centers, there's been a steady stream of new development from state agencies and private industry. Several off-road vehicles have been developed which can be used for transportation, to pull fire plows, or to bring water to the fire line. New planes have also been designed specifically for firefighting. Built to fill its tanks while skimming over the water, the Canadair Super Scooper was developed in Quebec to take advantage of Canada's extensive inland lakes and waterways. This agile amphibian can drop up to 8,000 gallons of water per hour in wildfires. Space-age technology has revolutionized the collecting of weather information, which is the backbone of decision-making. Remote weather stations are now scattered across the vast wildlands. Powered by solar cells, they are completely self-contained and continually beam vital data to weather stations via satellite. Surveillance techniques have been borrowed from the military. The result has been an evolution of airborne infrared scanners for forest fire detection. Sensitive to infrared radiation, the scanner produces an image of the terrain below, along with the existing fires, even when the scene is visually obscured by smoke or darkness. The smoke jumper program is still a viable means of suppressing remote fires quickly. Helicopters have gained an important role in transporting firefighters and equipment. Where no level clearing is available for landing, a rope can be lowered from the hovering craft. Men and supplies are then safely rappelled to the ground using a special braking device. Although smoke jumpers and rappellers have about them the special aura of an elite group, once they're on the ground, the job is just as hot, dirty, and dangerous as it always was. A great deal of progress has been made in our battle against wildfire. But the question remains, has the war been successful? The answer is a qualified yes. A great deal of knowledge has been gained, and our tools for controlling fire greatly improved. The catastrophic million-acre conflagrations should remain a thing of the past. However, the enemy has not surrendered. Fires out of control still devastate thousands of acres of forest and brushland yearly, as well as the homes and commercial property in their path. And so, the fight goes on.